Hi, so I'm Richard, and I'm going to talk about something I help my clients with, and that's impact-driven development. So if we ask ourselves, why do businesses build software? Building software is pretty expensive. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money. But why do they do it? They do it for an impact, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So that impact normally means some kind of competitive advantage, some kind of thing that makes life better for a customer, something that makes life more efficient for your employees. But they do it for a reason. They want an output. They want an outcome. So that's what I call impact-driven development. So a lot of teams use Agile. A lot of teams use Scrum, in the belief as a form of Agile. And one of the Scrum books, the well-known Scrum book, has the title Twice the Work in Half the Time. And I contend that's the wrong question. So instead, I think we should actually be aiming for twice the impact in half the time. And there's a big difference between those two things. So a lot of businesses measure output. And this has been the main focus for nearly 200 years now, actually. So, the assembly lines in Victorian ages, the Industrial Revolution, Taylorism, a lot of management for a long time is focused on outcome, which is all about how much stuff can you get done. In the general belief that the more stuff you get done, the better life is. And that's partly true, but it's not the full story. So what you really need is you need an outcome. So it's not just about doing stuff, but it's about how much difference that stuff makes. So the first thing that's obviously true is if you have no output, you probably have no outcome. So that's obviously not so good. But if you don't direct that output, you probably won't get an outcome either. So if you're familiar with the Agile Manifesto, it's a set of sort of principles, and the seventh one of these is working software is the primary measure of progress. And what this is saying is that instead of using sort of Gantt charts, predictions, numbers, excuses, whatever else you use to sort of tell the boss how well your software project's going, the best one is actually working software. But this is kind of interesting though, because it depends how you define working. So a lot of teams think in terms of working as being sort of ready to release. So working means defect free, or working means, we're ready to ship this to a customer now. But that's really only where things start. So instead, what we can do is we can start thinking of working as, is it actually making a difference? And actually, is it making the right difference? So one of the big sort of fallacies in software development is the assumption that we know what the work is, and just doing what we think we should do will be good enough. And that's sometimes true, but it's often not. Not the first attempt anyway. So if we want to help ourselves make a bigger outcome and a more impact sooner, how can we do that? So there's a set of questions that I use with teams to help them do this. So the first question is all about priorities. What's most important right now? We can break this into two parts. First is, what's most important? So if you're trying to think about what's important, you need to think about your customers. So you need to think about who are your customers. Maybe you have multiple different types of customers. Maybe they have very different traits between these different groups, and they might care about different things. So what matters most to your customers is a great place to start thinking about how you can make a difference. That's not necessarily the same as what your business wants. But what does your business want, and why do they want it? Because if you know that, then you can optimize around it. So a really powerful question that you can ask in your team, right now, what are the 3 weakest things? And why are they the weakest? So that might be things like, we want to get more customers because, we want more money. It might be that we want to keep our existing customers because people will leave. It might be that, we've got an internal process that's not so quick, so we want to save some time. But if you know this, then you can focus your efforts on this. And now the second part of this question is right now. So this should change. So if you're working on the weakest thing and you're improving the weakest thing, at a certain point, it will stop being the weakest thing. And that's really powerful because that means what you're doing is working. So if that's the case and what you're doing is working, then you need to be able to reassess. Because if you were working on the weakest thing and now it's not the weakest thing, and you keep working on it, well, you're in the wrong place now. So you need some kind of planning process that lets you steer as you go. And that comes into the world of backlogs and all that fun. And if the longer the backlog is, the harder it is to sort of detach from it and react to the reality of your current situation. And this is a big problem for a lot of teams. So you need some kind of way of planning adaptively. So as you get results, as you see what's happening, you steer based on it. Now, the second thing you need to know if you're going to try and make an impact is, what does better look like? So the first thing you need to think about is, what does better mean? So what are you hoping to see? Like, you're building this feature, why? Like, what do you think will happen because you built this feature? Like, how do you think it will change user behavior? How do you think it'll improve their day? One of the other sort of things that often teams have a habit of doing is people think in terms of done. So people have a definition of done, but what does done even sort of mean? Like, is Amazon.com done? Or they make improvements multiple times a day, so they don't think so. So what does done mean? Like, done is perfect? Is anything perfect? And then the third thing is, do you need perfect? You probably don't. You know, if you're spending your time and your money, there's probably a point where you stop because you've already won. So how good do you need to make it? And then the second half of this question is, what does that look like? So how can you tell how much better you've made a thing? Well, you need to measure it somehow. So you need to be able to measure it easily, because you need to be able to measure it often. So some of the things you can do if you're trying to measure your system would be things like putting in user feedback, maybe analytics, some metrics, using survey scores, talking to a customer. All these things will give you some kind of measure of what you're doing. So ideally, if you're working in a short cycle and making improvements often, you want to repeat these tests. So it has to be a test you can do often. If you do things like performance tests and they're hard to run, then you can't run them as much. So, not so useful. And then the third question we need to start asking ourselves is, where's the leverage? So we've probably all heard of things like the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. So this was an Italian guy in the 18th century, I believe, who observed that in lots of things, obviously there's a whole population of stuff, but most of the results come from a very small fraction of the people. So, for example, we all know the famous sort of 99% of the wealth, 1% of the population. The probability is in your business, probably 80% or more of your revenue probably comes from 20% or less of your customers. You probably spend 20% or less of your time on getting that revenue. And if you understand in your world where that is, then you can really focus on the things that make the biggest difference. So again, one of the big sort of fallacies is that you need to build all of something to make a difference. So if you can understand where the parts of your system are that make the biggest difference, you can focus just on these. So I'm actually working with a client right now who had this problem. They had a system with 200 endpoints and they wanted to improve the performance. And their belief was that basically they'd have to change the performance of all 200. Well, actually, we could drill into some data here. So because we're looking to improve performance, we can measure performance. And one of the things we can look at is things like which one has the most impact. And it turned out actually, from these 200 endpoints, something like 92% of the load came from 3 endpoints out of 200. So that's nice. We'll forget the rest and we'll just do those 3. And then within that, which parts of those are the most effective? So you might end up only having to do a fraction of the work to get the results you need. And this is why it's not about doing twice the work in half the time. It's about finding the right work and doing that. So there's a bunch of ways we can do this. It starts from, again, understanding your system. So breaking down metrics, understanding where the impact is. Then it's about simplifying your design and filtering things based on the cost value. So we've all seen things like, I need a search box. It would be great if it had autocomplete. It's like, okay, right. So if you had a search box, I can do that in like an hour. autocomplete, maybe a day now. Is it worth spending the day? If you just had the search box, if you already won, like, do you need to add that little bit of gold plating, or are you good as you are? So the next piece of this is how can we deliver that outcome sooner? So again, we can split this into two pieces. So sooner, that matters quite a lot. So people measure a lot of things in software projects, things like story points and velocity and burn downs and all that kind of stuff. None of that matters. We can get rid of all of those and replace it with a single thing, which is cycle time. So that's literally, I have an idea right now. How soon can I get that to a user? That's your cycle time. A day is great. 2 days is okay. 3 days is acceptable. That's not what most teams have. If you've got a backlog of 100 items, and when do you do the 97th item on that backlog? Probably never. This is what we need to try and get away from. So how can we start getting ideas just into people's hands? And that's driven by three main things. So the first of those is architecture and technical strategy. So coming up with a simple design, and coming up with a simple design that lets you release small things. So designing around things like, I don't know, you might go for microservices or bounded contexts as a way of breaking things into small parts so that you can improve one of those small parts and release it without having to do the whole lot. You need things like a decent test strategy. That comes under your technical strategy. You also need team autonomy. So the more often you leave a team boundary, the harder it is to get anything done. So if you're in an organization where you've got lots of handoffs, lots of, if you need an infrastructure team to do this, you need the test team to do that, whatever, all those things will slow you down. And then the third thing you'll need is a good delivery and release strategy. So this is where you need to start thinking from the start about how you're going to ship things. So things like feature toggles, things like continuous integration, how are you going to get a feature from your laptop to your customers and build that into your design. And with all these things, you need to have a purpose to it. So if you have a meeting and you don't know what it's for, you probably shouldn't have that meeting. If you have a process and you don't know what it's for, you probably shouldn't have that process. And it's amazing actually how much waste you can remove from an average team. It's probably like 80% plus of what most teams do end up being waste. The second part of this question is how you deliver it. So again, good quality strategy. If you can't release code because you don't know whether it works or not, then you're never going to make much of an impact. So you need to have a test suite that you trust. Ideally, you want to be moving towards continuous delivery so that you can just press a button and if the tests go green, then off it goes to production. Again, if we design for releasability with things like feature toggles, a rollout model, canary releases, it means we can ship things faster. And then finally, if we collaborate, if we remove the handoffs and build things together as a team, we can ship things faster. So there we go. So that's what I call impact-driven development. And as I say, there's these 4 questions, and we can start using those in our teams pretty much straight away, and people will only thank us for it. So thank you very much. If you've got any questions, you can dump them in the chat or my emails on the slides. And thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Danny.